7 men waited outside the Cotton Club, hands heavy with metal, eyes light with disrespect. Bumpy Johnson stepped into the street alone, calm enough to make everyone wonder who was actually trapped. The street outside the Cotton Club breathes slowly. Neon hums without warmth. Music leaks through brick and velvet curtains, but it doesn't reach the sidewalk. Out here, sound knows better than to travel freely. 7 men stand spaced apart, not close enough to trust each other, not far enough to pretend they're alone. Coats hang heavy, hands stay low, metal waits where words usually go. They've chosen this spot because it feels public enough to be safe, dark enough to be forgotten. They think the night belongs to them. A car rolls past without stopping. A door closes somewhere behind tinted glass. Harlem watches without staring. It always does. Windows hold their breath. Doorways become witnesses. Nobody interferes. Nobody ever does when a moment like this announces itself. Then Bumpy Johnson steps into the street. No rush, no hesitation, no men behind him. His shoes touch the pavement like they've been there before, which they have. He doesn't scan faces, doesn't count bodies, doesn't adjust his coat to show or hide anything. His hands remain visible, empty, patient. That's the first thing that unsettles them. Power usually arrives loud. It brings engines, footsteps, backup. This arrives quietly. One of the 7 shifts his weight. Another tightens his jaw. Someone clears his throat and immediately regrets making noise. The circle isn't a circle yet, but it's thinking about becoming one. Bumpy stops where the light breaks clean across his face. He doesn't smile. He doesn't frown. He looks like a man who already knows how this ends, but isn't in a hurry to get there. The street narrows around him, not physically, but socially. Every inch of space suddenly feels owned, not claimed, owned. Like furniture that's been paid for long ago. These men came prepared for fear. They practiced it in their heads. They rehearsed how fear would look on another man's face. What they didn't prepare for was calm. Bumpy's eyes move now, not fast, not sharp, just enough to acknowledge each man as a separate problem. That matters. Groups hide courage. Individuals don't. A passing laugh spills from inside the club, then dies against the door. The contrast feels wrong. Like laughter happened in the wrong universe. Someone's finger brushes a trigger. Not enough to fire. Enough to feel brave. Bumpy finally speaks, not loud enough to challenge the music, not soft enough to be ignored. His voice lands where shouting never could. The street listens. Nobody moves yet. Nobody breathes easily. This isn't a standoff. It's an assessment. And every man there begins to understand something unsettling. They brought weapons to a place where reputation already did the talking. Harlem doesn't announce loyalty. It doesn't clap. It doesn't chant. It simply remembers. Bumpy Johnson stands under the streetlight like he belongs to it, like the concrete was poured with his name already mixed in. This neighborhood has seen men flash power before. Guns, money, borrowed muscle. But those men always needed noise. They needed witnesses. They needed proof. Bumpy never did. The men facing him feel it before they understand it. The way the block refuses to empty. The way nobody peeks too hard. But nobody leaves either. Doors stay cracked. Lights stay on. This isn't curiosity. It's an acknowledgement. Every storefront here has a memory of him. A rent paid quietly. A dispute settled without blood. A warning delivered once and never repeated. That's the difference. Violence makes a point once. Reputation keeps making it when you're not around. One of the 7 tries to lock eyes with him, searching for weakness, or anger, or pride, anything that might push Bumpy into proving something. He finds none of it. Just a man who already knows his value and doesn't negotiate with disbelief. Bumpy doesn't name Harlem. He doesn't have to. The street names itself and how it behaves around him. A bus hisses at the corner and keeps moving. A couple steps out of a doorway, takes one look, and quietly steps back inside. Not fear, respect for the moment. This is not their scene. The men with guns begin to feel heavy. Not because they might be used, but because carrying them suddenly feels unnecessary. Excess weight, like armor worn to a meeting that requires a handshake. Bumpy shifts slightly, not to threaten, to settle his stance. It's the movement of someone comfortable standing still for a long time. He speaks again, measured, even. Not a lecture, not a warning, just enough words to remind them where they are. This isn't neutral ground. In Harlem, authority doesn't come from who you scare. It comes from who still stands with you when you don't raise your voice. The seven realize something together, though none of them would admit it out loud. If anything happens here, it won't stay here. Not because of revenge, because of memory. Bumpy Johnson doesn't need witnesses tonight, but Harlem is watching anyway, and watching has always been enough. The guns were supposed to simplify things. Metal has a way of doing that, reducing choices, ending conversations before they begin. That was the plan. Walk up armed, stand firm, let fear fill the space between bodies, but fear doesn't arrive on schedule. Each of the seven men feels it shift, not toward Bumpy, but inward. The weight on their hips, under their coats, starts to feel like a question instead of an answer. Guns only work when everyone agrees on what they mean. Right now, nobody agrees on anything. One man keeps his hand too close to his jacket. Another lets his drift away, like touching the weapon might somehow break the moment. They don't look at each other. They can't afford to. Eye contact would admit uncertainty, and uncertainty spreads fast. Bumpy watches them the way a seasoned man watches weather, without anger, without hope. He doesn't challenge the guns. He makes them irrelevant. He says nothing for a stretch of seconds that feels longer than it is. Silence becomes the loudest thing on the block. In that quiet, each man imagines the same outcome differently, and that's the problem. Power needs unity. Fear doesn't. One of them shifts his feet, angling his body sideways, defensive. Another straightens, overcompensating, trying to reclaim dominance through posture. None of it works, because dominance isn't loud tonight. It's settled. Bumpy finally speaks again. Fewer words this time. Words chosen not to provoke, but to define. He doesn't threaten consequences. He doesn't need to. Consequences already exist, walking these streets every day with his name attached to them. The men realize they've misread the situation. This wasn't a showdown. It was an invitation to decide who they wanted to be when the night was over. Pull a gun and become a problem Harlem would remember. Walk away and become a story that ends here. Nobody wants to be remembered the wrong way. One man swallows hard. Another exhales through his nose, slow and controlled, as if convincing himself that restraint was his idea all along. The weapons remain hidden, but their presence feels louder now, like a bad decision waiting for permission. Bumpy takes a single step forward, not aggressive, not suddenly, just enough to remind them he's not standing still out of fear. That step redraws the room. The men with guns understand something in unison, though none of them planned to learn it tonight. Power doesn't rush, it doesn't flinch, and it doesn't need to explain itself. They came armed, but they came unprepared. Disrespect doesn't always speak first. Sometimes it arrives early and waits. The insult tonight wasn't shouted. No slurs, no challenges. It lived in the way the seven men positioned themselves, in how they chose the sidewalk, in the assumption that Bumpy Johnson would need to respond, to explain, to threaten, to prove. That assumption hangs heavier than the guns. Bumpy feels it, but he doesn't acknowledge it the way they expect. He doesn't correct them. He lets the insult sit there, exposed, growing uncomfortable in the open air. Disrespect loses power when it isn't answered on its own terms. One man finally breaks the silence, not with words meant for peace, words meant to test, casual, almost friendly. That's how men disguise challenges when they're not sure of the outcome. Bumpy listens without interrupting. That matters. Listening is controlled. It forces the other man to finish what he started, to hear himself say it all the way to the end. By the time the words stop, they sound smaller than intended. Bumpy replies evenly. No edge, no volume. He doesn't raise his chin or lean forward. He stays exactly where he is, anchored. His response isn't long enough to quote later. That's intentional. Long speeches invite argument. Short sentences close doors. The insult doesn't survive the exchange. What replaces it is something worse for the seven men: clarity. They understand now that this isn't about territory or pride. It's about hierarchy. and hierarchy doesn't require permission. The street seems closer than before, like it's leaning in. Shadows stretch toward the center of the moment. Even the music from the Cotton Club fades, as if it knows better than to compete. One of the men laughs nervously, then stops when nobody joins him. Humor fails when no one believes the joke. Bumpy lets the quiet do the work. He allows space for realization. He gives them dignity by not rushing their understanding. That, more than anything, unsettles them. Violence would have been simpler. Insults could be answered with anger. But respect, real respect, forces reflection, and reflection is dangerous for men who come ready to act, not think. By the time Bumpy finishes speaking, the insult has nowhere left to stand. It collapses under its own emptiness. The 7 men remain armed, but now they're exposed. This is where most men would raise their voice, where they'd lean in, remind everyone what's at stake. Let anger sharpen the edges. Bumpy does none of that. He lowers the temperature instead, not by retreating, but by settling deeper into himself. The street feels smaller now, not crowded, contained. Like an invisible boundary has been drawn, and everyone inside it understands the rules. The 7 men sense it immediately. There's no room left for theatrics, no space for bravado to breathe. Bumpy speaks one last time. His voice doesn't chase attention. It waits for it. What he says isn't dramatic. There's no promise of violence, no warning dressed up as mercy. It's something more final than that, a statement of reality, of how things are and how they will remain, whether tonight ends quietly or not. That's when it happens. One man reaches inside his coat. The others tense, instinctively preparing for chaos, but the motion stops short of disaster. The weapon comes out slowly, deliberately, not pointed, not brandished. He places it on the pavement. The sound it makes is small, almost disappointing. Metal touching concrete. Final. Nobody reacts, not even Bumpy. The choice spreads. Another man removes his gun. Then another. Each movement is careful, controlled, almost respectful. No one wants to be the last. No one wants to be the one who doesn't understand in time. 7 weapons lie on the street, not surrendered in fear, left behind in acknowledgement. Bumpy watches without satisfaction. This isn't a victory for him. It's a correction. Order restored with minimal effort, maximum effect. He doesn't collect guns. He doesn't kick them away. That would turn the moment into something smaller than it is. He lets them stay where they are, a reminder for anyone who might pass later. The men step back, one by one. No insults now, no eye contact, just quiet agreement that this night has gone as far as it ever should have. Bumpy finally turns away, not because it's over, but because it never needed to go further. Behind him, the street exhales. Harlem resumes its rhythm. Doors open again. Music leaks back into the night. 7 men walk away lighter than they arrived, not because they lost their weapon, because they learned when not to use them. The street doesn't celebrate. It absorbs. The weapons stay where they were placed for a moment longer, like punctuation at the end of a sentence nobody dares to reread. Then someone from the club quietly moves them out of sight. No ceremony, no curiosity. Certain things don't need discussion. Bumpy Johnson is already gone. He doesn't look back. He never does. Looking back suggests doubt or satisfaction. He carries neither. What happened outside the Cotton Club doesn't belong to him anymore. It belongs to Harlem now. The 7 men disappear into different directions. That matters. Groups dissolve after lessons like this. Nobody wants to share the memory too closely. Each man walks away, carrying something heavier than fear, understanding. They didn't lose a fight. They were spared one. By morning, the story will have trimmed itself. No embellishment, no heroics, just the part that matters. 7 men arrived armed and left empty-handed. No shots, no bodies, no police. That's how respect travels. Clean, efficient, undeniable. In the days that follow, nothing changes, and that's the point. Businesses open on time. Corners hold their usual conversations. Music plays where it always has. Order maintained without spectacle. Bumpy's name moves quietly through the city, not as a threat, but as a reference, a reminder of how things are handled when they're handled correctly. Some men chase legacy by leaving scars. Bumpy builds is by preventing them. The power he showed that night wasn't dominance through force, it was restraint through certainty, the kind of authority that makes violence unnecessary because everyone understands the cost before it's paid. Harlem remembers nights like this longer than shootouts, because this is what stability looks like. This is how a community survives without tearing itself apart. Years from now, when the street has changed and the signs have been replaced, the lesson will still be there, passed along in half sentences, in pauses, in how men choose their words carefully when his name comes up. 7 guns touched the pavement that night. But what really walked away was something more important, the understanding that power, when it's real, doesn't need to announce itself. It simply stands still and lets the world adjust.